Marcus Rivera adjusted his championship belt with deliberate slowness, the polished leather creaking softly against his muscular frame as he surveyed the crowded boxing gym with the calculated gaze of a predator selecting its next meal. The worn leather showed the patina of years of wear, its bronze buckle catching the harsh fluorescent light that bathed the training floor in stark, unforgiving illumination. The Golden Gloves Academy buzzed with the familiar symphony of athletic endeavor, the rhythmic thudding of leather gloves against heavy bags that hung like silent sentinels throughout the space, the sharp staccato snap of speed bags being worked by quick hands that moved in blur-like patterns, the shuffle and scrape of feet dancing across canvas-covered floors, and the occasional grunt of exertion from fighters pushing their bodies to their absolute limits. The evening training sessions were winding down in their usual chaotic fashion, casting long shadows across the concrete floor from the harsh fluorescent lights mounted high above on industrial fixtures that had seen better decades. The shadows created dramatic patterns across the worn training surfaces, highlighting the scuffs and stains that told stories of countless hours of dedication, sweat, and determination. Marcus found himself anticipating these particular transition moments when parents began trickling in through the heavy metal doors to collect their children, their civilian clothes and concerned expressions contrasting sharply with the athletic intensity that permeated every corner of his domain. These transitional periods provided him with golden opportunities to remind everyone present exactly who commanded this particular corner of the sporting world, who held ultimate authority over every aspect of training and instruction, and whose reputation cast the longest and most intimidating shadow over every square foot of training space. The walls bore elaborate testimony to his achievements. Framed newspaper clippings from his regional championship victories carefully mounted behind protective glass, photographs of him raising gloved hands in triumph while crowds cheered in the background, action shots of him delivering devastating combinations to overwhelmed opponents, and most prominently displayed, his gleaming golden trophy that caught and reflected the overhead lighting like a beacon of his superiority and dominance. He had cultivated this atmosphere deliberately and systematically over the years, ensuring that every person who entered his gym understood the hierarchy without question and respected the chain of command that placed him firmly and unquestionably at the apex. The trophy case dominated one entire wall, its contents carefully arranged to tell the story of his rise through the amateur ranks to regional professional success. Training certificates from renowned coaches hung alongside the memorabilia, and motivational posters featuring boxing legends shared space with local newspaper features that chronicled his victories and achievements. The heavy metal doors at the entrance groaned on their well-worn hinges as Sarah Martinez pushed through them, the sound echoing briefly in the cavernous space before being absorbed by the ambient noise of ongoing training activities. Her tired eyes, bearing the gentle lines that spoke of countless nights spent worrying about her son's well-being and future, immediately began their familiar scan across the bustling interior in search of her 15-year-old son, Dany. The process had become routine over the months since Dany had started training here, but she never took his safety for granted, never assumed that everything was proceeding normally without visual confirmation. The familiar cocktail of aromas hit her senses like a physical presence, aged leather worn smooth by countless training sessions and bearing the accumulated scent of years of use, the sharp tang of antiseptic cleaning solutions that spoke of Marcus's attention to hygiene and professional standards, the metallic scent of well-used equipment that had been maintained but showed honest wear, and underlying it all, the honest smell of human sweat and determination that permeated every serious athletic facility like an invisible badge of authenticity. She spotted Dany near the cluster of heavy bags positioned in the far corner of the gym, the area designated for fundamental skill development and conditioning work. His lean frame moved with growing confidence and developing technique as he practiced combinations alongside two other teenagers who had become his regular training partners over the past several months. The three boys had formed a natural bond based on their similar skill levels and shared commitment to improvement, and Sarah had watched their friendship develop alongside their boxing abilities. "Dany, let's wrap up," she called softly, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach him without disrupting the other fighters who were still deep in their own training routines and personal zones of concentration. The gym operated on an unspoken code of respect for others' training time, and Sarah was careful to observe these informal protocols, even though she was technically just a parent picking up her child. She settled onto one of the worn wooden benches positioned strategically in the observation area, the surface polished smooth by years of parents, coaches, and fighters taking brief respites from the intensity of training. The bench creaked slightly under her weight, adding its voice to the symphony of sounds that filled the space, the rhythmic impacts, the shuffle of footwork, the occasional instruction called out by junior coaches, and the steady hum of ventilation fans working to circulate air through the warm, humid environment. At 42 years old, Sarah had long ago made the conscious and liberating decision to stop caring about superficial appearances and the endless pressure to present herself according to society's rigid expectations for women her age. The decision had been gradual but ultimately freeing, allowing her to focus her energy on more important matters than the approval of strangers or adherence to arbitrary standards of presentation. Her faded blue jeans bore the honest marks of a working mother, small stains from cooking that had resisted repeated washing attempts, slight wear at the knees from countless hours spent at Dany's eye level during his younger years, when he needed more hands-on guidance and comfort, and the soft patina that came from being washed and worn countless times until they achieved the perfect combination of comfort and functionality. Her simple cotton sweater, a muted forest green that had once been vibrant and eye-catching, told the story of someone who prioritized function over fashion, comfort over style, and practicality over presentation. The color had faded gradually over years of washing, but the fabric remained soft and comfortable, providing exactly the warmth and coverage she needed without drawing unnecessary attention or requiring special care. The sweater had become like an old friend, reliable and comforting in its familiarity. Her dark hair, now streaked here and there with premature silver that caught the harsh gym lighting and added distinguished highlights to her overall appearance, was pulled back in a practical ponytail, secured with an elastic band that had definitely seen better days. The hairstyle was functional rather than fashionable, designed to keep her hair out of her face during busy days while requiring minimal maintenance or attention. She had long ago abandoned the time-consuming styling routines that many women her age maintained, finding greater satisfaction in spending that time on activities that had more meaningful impact on her life and her son's development. Her face bore the gentle lines and subtle marks that life had etched there through years of laughter that created crow's feet around her eyes, worry lines from countless nights spent concerned about Dany's well-being and future, determination that had carved subtle grooves around her mouth, and the countless small expressions that mothers wear when watching their children navigate the complexities of growing up in an increasingly challenging world. These were not the artificial lines that expensive cosmetic procedures tried to erase, but rather the honest evidence of someone who had lived fully and experienced the complete range of human emotions while maintaining her essential humanity and compassion. Marcus finished barking his final instructions at a group of amateur fighters who were working through their cool-down routines, his booming voice echoing off the concrete walls and reverberating through the high ceiling space with the authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. His regional championship trophy positioned with careful precision on a custom-built shelf where it could catch the maximum amount of available light and remain visible from virtually every angle in the gym, gleamed like a golden monument to his achievements and a constant reminder of his superiority. The trophy represented more than just a single victory. It symbolized years of dedication, sacrifice, and the kind of focused determination that separated champions from also-rans. Marcus never missed an opportunity to remind people of the victories it represented, the opponents he had defeated on his way to claiming it, and the respect it commanded throughout the local boxing community. The trophy had become central to his identity, a physical manifestation of his worth and the foundation upon which he had built his reputation and his business. "Keep your guard up, Williams," he bellowed at a struggling teenager whose technique was beginning to deteriorate as fatigue set in from an intense training session. The boy's shoulders were dropping, his hands were falling away from his face, and his footwork was becoming sloppy as exhaustion took its toll on his concentration and muscle memory. "My grandmother could punch harder than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. If you can't maintain proper form when you're tired, you'll never survive in the ring when it matters." The comment was delivered with the casual cruelty that had become his trademark teaching method, a pedagogical approach that relied more on humiliation and intimidation than encouragement and positive reinforcement. Marcus believed that boxing was a harsh sport that required harsh preparation, and he saw psychological pressure as an essential component of proper training. His philosophy was that fighters who couldn't handle verbal abuse in the gym would never survive the psychological warfare that was an integral part of competitive boxing. The other fighters in the vicinity exchanged nervous glances, their eyes meeting briefly before looking away. Their respect for their coach tinged with an undercurrent of fear that made them hesitant to relax or let their guard down even during rest periods. They had all been on the receiving end of his verbal assaults at various times, and they understood that maintaining his approval required constant vigilance and perfect adherence to his standards. Sarah watched quietly from her position on the bench, her trained eye automatically analyzing Marcus's technique, even as she observed his teaching methods with growing concern. His fundamentals were undeniably solid. His stance showed the proper balance between mobility and stability that came from years of correct instruction. His hand positioning demonstrated deep understanding of defensive principles, and his power generation came from textbook hip rotation and weight transfer that maximized force while maintaining balance. These were the technical skills that had carried him to regional success and earned him the trophy that dominated his wall display and his sense of self-worth. However, his arrogance was unmistakable, radiating from him like heat from a forge, coloring every interaction and poisoning what should have been positive teaching moments with unnecessary negativity and psychological intimidation. She could see how his need to dominate affected the atmosphere of the entire gym, creating an environment where young fighters learned to associate improvement with fear rather than joy, progress with anxiety rather than satisfaction. She had encountered his type before in her previous life, during the years when she moved through different gyms and training facilities across the country, when she faced various opponents who brought different challenges and worked with numerous coaches who employed vastly different methodologies, fighters who were talented enough to dominate local and regional competition, successful enough to develop egos that grew far beyond their actual accomplishments, and skilled enough to believe their own carefully cultivated hype without ever being seriously challenged or humbled by genuinely superior opposition. They were dangerous, not because of their physical abilities, which were often quite impressive within their limited spheres of competition, but because their confidence was built on a foundation of limited competition and inflated self-importance that had never been properly tested against truly elite opposition. They had never faced the humbling experience of competing against fighters who operated on a completely different level, who could expose the gaps in their knowledge and the limitations of their abilities with surgical precision. "Coach Rivera really pushes them hard," whispered one mother to another parent sitting nearby, her voice carefully modulated to avoid being overheard by the coach himself, who had demonstrated on previous occasions that he did not appreciate criticism or questioning of his methods. The woman's expression showed a mixture of admiration for the obvious dedication he brought to training and concern about the psychological cost of his approach to instruction. "But Dany's definitely improved so much since starting here," she continued, gesturing toward where the boys were finishing their training routines. "His confidence is completely different now. He carries himself better, he's more assertive at school, and he seems to have found something that really motivates him to work hard and push himself." "He certainly commands respect," the other parent replied, though her tone carried subtle undercurrents that suggested she found his methods questionable at best and potentially harmful at worst. Her body language spoke volumes about her discomfort with the atmosphere of fear and intimidation that Marcus cultivated so deliberately, the way young fighters seemed to walk on eggshells around him, and the manner in which he seemed to genuinely enjoy wielding his authority over people who were completely dependent on his instruction and approval for their development in the sport they loved. 20 minutes later, Dany jogged over to where his mother sat waiting patiently, his young face flushed from the intensity of his training session, his hair damp with honest sweat, and his eyes bright with the particular satisfaction that came from pushing himself through another challenging workout and feeling the incremental improvements that resulted from consistent effort. His movement showed the developing confidence and body awareness that came from months of dedicated training, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of maternal pride as she watched him approach with the easy gait of someone who was becoming comfortable in his own skin. "Ready, Mum?" he asked, slightly out of breath but grinning with the infectious enthusiasm that had characterized his attitude toward boxing since his very first tentative lesson several months earlier. "Just need to grab my gear from the locker and say goodbye to the guys." His voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who had worked hard and felt the tangible rewards of his effort in improved technique, increased conditioning, and growing confidence. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah replied warmly, rising from the bench with the fluid motion of someone whose body remembered athletic grace even after years away from competitive training. Her movement was economical and controlled, showing none of the stiffness or awkwardness that characterized many people her age who had never maintained a high level of physical conditioning. "How was today's session?" she asked, genuinely interested in his experience and development. "You look like you were really getting into those combinations during the latter part of your workout. Your form looked much more natural than it did even a few weeks ago." "It was really good, Mom," Dany said enthusiastically, his voice bubbling with excitement as he began gathering his equipment from various locations around his designated training area. "Coach showed us some new defensive moves that are way more advanced than anything we've been working on before. Really sophisticated stuff about reading opponents and timing counters." He paused in his collection activities to demonstrate one of the movements he had learned, his young body moving with growing precision and understanding. "He thinks I might actually be ready for my first amateur bout next month if I keep improving at this rate and can demonstrate consistent performance under pressure." Pride swelled in Sarah's chest like a warm tide, filling her with the deep satisfaction that only came from watching her child overcome significant obstacles and develop genuine confidence through his own sustained efforts and dedication. Dany had struggled significantly with bullies at school before discovering boxing, enduring months of harassment and intimidation that had left him withdrawn, reluctant to engage with his peers and questioning his own worth and capabilities. The bullying had been particularly cruel because it targeted his smaller stature and quiet demeanor, characteristics that the bullies had interpreted as weakness and vulnerability. Dany had come home on numerous occasions with his clothes disheveled, his books scattered, and his spirit diminished by encounters with classmates who seemed to derive satisfaction from making others feel small and powerless. Watching him gain genuine confidence, develop real physical skills, and learn to carry himself with quiet dignity made every financial sacrifice she had made to afford his training absolutely worthwhile. The monthly fees represented a significant portion of her budget as a single mother, requiring her to make careful choices about other expenses and occasionally work additional hours to ensure that Dany could continue his training without interruption. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable, straighter posture that reflected internal confidence rather than external bravado, more direct eye contact that spoke of someone who was comfortable with himself, and the quiet self-assurance that came from knowing he possessed the skills to defend himself if circumstances made such action necessary. Perhaps most importantly, he had learned that true strength came from discipline and self-control rather than aggression and intimidation. As they gathered his equipment, hand wraps that still carried the faint scent of liniment and showed the wear patterns of regular use, well-worn gloves that had molded to the shape of his developing hands and bore the honest marks of countless training sessions, and protective gear that showed the accumulated evidence of dedication and consistent effort. Marcus's voice suddenly cut through the ambient noise of the gym like a blade through fabric, sharp and commanding in a way that demanded immediate attention from everyone present. "Hold up, everyone," he announced loudly, his voice carrying the theatrical projection of someone who was accustomed to being the center of attention and who genuinely enjoyed commanding an audience of people who depended on his expertise and approval. "Before we close up shop tonight, who wants to see something truly educational? Something that will teach you about the real world of combat sports and the difference between fantasy and reality?" The gym fell silent with an abruptness that was almost startling, the various conversations and activities grinding to a halt as all attention turned toward their commanding coach like iron filings drawn to a powerful magnet. The sudden quiet was filled with palpable tension, as if everyone instinctively sensed that something significant was about to unfold, something that would alter the atmosphere and potentially create lasting memories for everyone present. Sarah felt an uncomfortable knot forming in her stomach, a primal warning system that had served her well throughout her life, and was now sending clear, unmistakable signals that the situation was developing in a potentially dangerous direction. Her maternal instincts, honed by years of protecting Dany from various threats and challenges, were alerting her to trouble even though she couldn't yet identify the specific nature of the danger. Marcus's gaze swept the room with deliberate slowness, taking in the faces of his fighters with their mixture of respect and apprehension. The watching parents with their varying degrees of comfort and concern, and the general atmosphere of anticipation he had created through his dramatic announcement. When his eyes finally settled on Sarah, a predatory smile spread across his weathered features, the expression of someone who had identified his target and was already savoring the anticipated outcome of whatever demonstration he was planning. His smile held no warmth, no genuine friendliness, no human connection or empathy. Instead, it radiated the cold calculation of a predator who had cornered prey and was preparing to demonstrate his dominance for the entertainment and education of his audience. The expression was familiar to anyone who had spent time around bullies and understood the psychology of those who derived satisfaction from the humiliation of others. "You know what?" he continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was about to deliver what he considered profound wisdom and important instruction. "I think we need a reality check tonight. A demonstration about the fundamental difference between trained fighters who have dedicated years to developing real skills and regular folks who think they understand what real combat is, about based on movies and misconceptions. Several of the younger boxers shifted uncomfortably in their positions around the gym, recognizing that this wasn't part of their usual training routine and sensing that the atmosphere had shifted from educational to something more troubling and potentially problematic. Their discomfort was visible in their body language, the way they avoided eye contact with their coach, and their obvious uncertainty about how to respond to the situation that was developing. The experienced fighters, those who had been training under Marcus for longer periods and had witnessed his ego-driven demonstrations before, recognized the signs of their coach's need for dominance, taking control and driving him toward a spectacle that would serve his psychological needs rather than any legitimate educational purpose. They had seen him target other parents and gym visitors when he felt the need to reinforce his position and remind everyone of his superiority. "Mom, let's just leave," Dany whispered urgently, tugging on her sleeve with the instinctive wisdom of youth, recognizing danger and wanting to avoid whatever unpleasantness was about to unfold. His voice carried the tension of someone who understood that his coach was about to do something that would cross ethical boundaries and create problems for everyone involved, particularly his mother. "I can get my stuff tomorrow morning before school," he added, his urgency increasing as he watched Marcus's predatory focus settle more firmly on his mother. "We don't need to stay for whatever this is going to be." But Marcus wasn't finished with his performance, wasn't ready to let his audience disperse before he had delivered what he clearly considered to be an important lesson about respect, hierarchy, and the realities of physical combat. He strode across the canvas-covered floor with exaggerated confidence, each footstep calculated to echo dramatically through the suddenly tense atmosphere and emphasize his dominance over the space and everyone in it. His movement was that of a performer taking the stage, someone who thrived on being the center of attention and who was building toward what he clearly considered to be a dramatic climax that would reinforce his position and authority while providing entertainment for his audience. The theatrical nature of his approach was obvious to anyone who understood the psychology of bullies and their need for public displays of dominance. The other parents looked around nervously, exchanging glances that communicated their shared uncertainty about whether this was planned instruction that they should allow to continue or something more troubling that required intervention from responsible adults. Some of them had witnessed Marcus's theatrical tendencies before, his need to demonstrate his superiority and his willingness to create uncomfortable situations to feed his ego, but this felt different, more targeted and potentially more serious than his usual displays of dominance. Several parents were clearly considering whether they should speak up or remove their children from the situation, but the social dynamics of the gym, where Marcus held absolute authority and parents were essentially guests, made intervention difficult and potentially problematic for their children's continued training. Sarah stood slowly, her maternal instincts fully activated and sending clear warning signals throughout her nervous system like alarm bells ringing in her consciousness. Every fiber of her being was alerting her to danger, not necessarily immediate physical threat to herself, but the recognition that whatever Marcus had planned would not end well for anyone involved and would likely create lasting negative consequences for multiple people. Her movement was controlled and deliberate, showing none of the tension that was building inside her as she prepared to protect her son and herself from whatever demonstration Marcus was orchestrating. Years of dealing with challenging situations had taught her the importance of remaining calm and avoiding escalation while still being prepared to take necessary action if circumstances demanded it. Marcus stopped directly in front of Sarah, using his imposing 6'2" frame to tower over her more modest 5'6" stature, in a classic intimidation display designed to emphasize the physical disparity between them and establish psychological dominance before any actual confrontation began. The positioning was deliberate and calculated, meant to make her feel small and vulnerable while demonstrating his physical advantages to the watching audience. The entire gym had gone eerily quiet. Even the teenagers who had been joking and chatting moments before now watched with uncomfortable silence, sensing that they were about to witness something that would make them all complicit in their coach's behavior. The silence was heavy with tension and anticipation, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a confrontation than an educational demonstration. "Ma'am," Marcus said loudly, his voice projected to ensure that everyone in the facility could hear every word of what was about to unfold, making it clear that this was intended as a public spectacle rather than a private conversation. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. You're Dany's mother, correct? The woman who's been sitting there every week watching us train and probably forming opinions about what real boxing looks like?" "That's right," Sarah replied evenly, her voice steady, despite the tension that was crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Her response carried no defensiveness, no fear, no indication that she was intimidated by his theatrical display of dominance. Instead, her tone conveyed the calm control of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than an egotistical boxing coach, and who was not easily rattled by aggressive posturing. Marcus's smile widened perceptibly, but there was absolutely no warmth in the expression, no genuine friendliness or human connection. It was the smile of someone who was about to enjoy what he anticipated would be easy prey, someone who had already decided how this encounter would unfold and was savoring the prospect of demonstrating his superiority in front of his captive audience. The smile revealed his true nature more clearly than any words could have, the cold satisfaction of someone who derived pleasure from the anticipated humiliation of others, particularly those he perceived as weaker or more vulnerable than himself. It was the expression of a bully who had found what he considered to be the perfect target for his need to dominate and control. "Well, since you're here watching us train week after week," he continued, his tone becoming more theatrical as he played to his audience and built the dramatic tension he was creating, "I was wondering if you've ever been curious about real boxing yourself. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to step into the ring with someone who actually knows what they're doing and has spent years developing genuine fighting skills?" Sarah felt Dany's hand slip into hers, his palm damp with nervous sweat and trembling slightly with the anxiety of watching his mother being targeted by his coach. His grip conveyed his fear, his embarrassment at being associated with this situation, and his desperate wish that they could simply leave and avoid whatever humiliation Marcus was planning to inflict on the woman who had sacrificed so much to support his boxing training. "Not really," Sarah answered honestly, her voice carrying the same calm steadiness that had characterized her previous response. "I'm quite content watching from the sidelines and supporting Dany's training. I think that's the most appropriate role for a parent in this environment." Her response was measured and diplomatic, offering Marcus a graceful way to end his demonstration without losing face in front of his fighters and maintaining the respect that he seemed to crave so desperately. "Oh, come on," Marcus continued, his tone becoming even more theatrical as he sensed the attention of his audience and fed off their uncomfortable energy like a performer feeding off audience reaction. "I bet you've seen those Hollywood movies with all the unrealistic fight scenes, thinking you could throw a punch like that, right? Most people do. They watch some actress fake her way through a choreographed fight scene and think they understand what real combat is about." He gestured broadly to encompass his audience, making it clear that his comments were intended for everyone present rather than just Sarah. People see these fantasy portrayals and develop completely unrealistic expectations about their own capabilities. It's actually dangerous because it gives them false confidence that could get them seriously hurt in a real confrontation. Nervous laughter rippled through the room, the uncomfortable sound of people who weren't sure whether they should be amused or concerned by their coach's behavior. The laughter was forced and uncertain, reflecting the general discomfort with the direction the conversation was taking and the growing recognition that Marcus was building towards something problematic. Sarah noticed several parents looking away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was heading and recognizing that Marcus was building towards something that crossed ethical boundaries and had moved far beyond appropriate behavior for a fitness instructor dealing with a customer. Their body language conveyed their wish to be anywhere else, while also reflecting their uncertainty about how to intervene without making the situation worse. "Actually, I don't really watch boxing movies," Sarah said, maintaining her composure with the discipline of someone who had learned to control her reactions under pressure and avoid escalation even when being deliberately provoked. "They tend to be unrealistic and don't accurately represent the sport. We should probably get home now. Dany has schoolwork to finish and it's getting late." Her attempt to end the encounter gracefully was polite but firm, giving Marcus another opportunity to back down from his confrontational path while saving face. She was offering him multiple exit strategies that would allow him to maintain his dignity while ending what was clearly becoming an inappropriate situation. But Marcus wasn't finished with his performance, wasn't ready to let his audience disperse before he had delivered what he clearly considered to be an important lesson about respect, hierarchy, and the realities of physical combat. His ego had taken control of the situation, and he was committed to seeing it through to whatever conclusion would satisfy his need for dominance and control. He took another step closer, his voice dropping just enough to seem conversational while still carrying throughout the gym, creating an intimate atmosphere that made everyone feel like they were witnessing something personal and significant. The positioning was calculated to increase the psychological pressure on Sarah while maintaining the theatrical aspect that he was clearly enjoying. "You know what?" he said, his tone suggesting that he had just been struck by inspiration, though it was clear to anyone paying attention that he had been planning this moment from the beginning and was simply following a script he had developed to maximize drama and impact. "I've got a much better idea than just talking about the differences between reality and fantasy." He paused for dramatic effect, allowing the tension to build and ensuring that he had everyone's complete attention before delivering what he clearly considered to be the climactic moment of his performance. The pause was calculated and theatrical, designed to increase anticipation and emphasize the importance of what he was about to propose. "How about a little demonstration?" he continued, his voice carrying false enthusiasm and manufactured excitement. "Nothing too serious, just a quick sparring session to show everyone the fundamental difference between real training and, well, wishful thinking. A practical lesson that everyone here can learn from and remember." The blood drained from Dany's face as he realized where this was heading, his complexion going pale as he understood that his coach was about to attempt to humiliate his mother in front of everyone he trained with. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and his grip on his mother's hand tightened as he tried to process the implications of what was about to unfold. "Coach Rivera," he began desperately, his voice cracking with emotion and the strain of trying to protect his mother while maintaining respect for his instructor. "My mom doesn't box. She's never trained. This isn't fair, and it's not right. Please don't do this." "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah interrupted softly, though her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the internal shift that was beginning to occur as she processed the situation and began to consider her options. Her voice remained calm and reassuring, designed to comfort her son even as she evaluated the threat level and began to prepare mentally for what might be necessary. Marcus clapped his hands together with theatrical enthusiasm, the sharp sound making several people jump and emphasizing the dramatic moment he was creating. The sound echoed through the gym like a gunshot, startling everyone and serving as a punctuation mark for his announcement. "Excellent!" he exclaimed with false bonhomie and exaggerated excitement. "Don't worry, Mrs. Martinez. I'll take it easy on you. Wouldn't want to seriously hurt someone who's never thrown a real punch in her life. This will just be a gentle demonstration of what real training looks like compared to civilian misconceptions about combat." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable and deliberate, dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that revealed his true character and his willingness to humiliate someone he perceived as weaker to feed his own ego and entertain his audience. His tone carried the implicit message that he considered her to be beneath his notice under normal circumstances, and that he was doing her a favor by providing this educational experience. Sarah could see the other boxers shifting uncomfortably around the gym, their body language revealing their internal conflict between loyalty to their coach and recognition that his behavior was crossing ethical boundaries. Some looked genuinely ashamed of their coach's behavior, recognizing that this reflected poorly on all of them and violated basic principles of respect and sportsmanship. Others seemed caught up in the excitement of potential entertainment, eager to see how the drama would unfold and curious about their coach's fighting abilities. "This really isn't necessary, Coach Rivera," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady and reasonable even as she recognized that Marcus was committed to his course of action and unlikely to be deterred by appeals to common sense, basic decency, or ethical behavior. "I'm sure your fighters understand the differences between professional training and amateur enthusiasm without needing a practical demonstration that could potentially result in injury." "Oh, but it absolutely is necessary," Marcus insisted, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that encompassed his entire audience and emphasized his role as the teacher delivering an important lesson to students who needed to understand fundamental truths about combat and competition. "See, too many people think they're tough because of what they see on movie screens or read in books. It's important for everyone here to understand the reality of real combat training versus suburban mom aerobics classes." The insult hung in the air like acrid smoke, sharp and designed to cut deeply, revealing the depth of his contempt and his willingness to be deliberately cruel to someone who had done nothing to provoke his aggression or deserve his hostility. The comment was calculated to demean not just Sarah, but all women who didn't fit his narrow definition of what constituted legitimate physical training. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger exactly, but a familiar coldness that she hadn't experienced in years. A detached calm that had once been as natural to her as breathing, but which she had deliberately suppressed for over a decade. It was the mental state that had allowed her to face the world's best fighters without fear, to remain analytical and strategic even under extreme pressure, and to execute complex techniques with perfect timing, regardless of the stakes involved. "Besides," Marcus continued, now clearly enjoying himself and feeding off the uncomfortable energy of his captive audience like a performer who had found his rhythm and was building toward a climactic moment, "what's the worst that could happen? A few gentle demonstrations, maybe a takedown or two to show the difference between trained reflexes and civilian responses. Consider it a free lesson in reality for everyone here, especially the parents who might have unrealistic expectations about their own capabilities." Around the room, reactions were mixed and telling, revealing the character and values of everyone present. Some of the younger fighters looked mortified by their coach's behavior, recognizing that this crossed fundamental lines of basic respect and human decency that should never be violated regardless of the circumstances. Others seemed caught up in the drama and excitement, eager to see their dominant coach demonstrate his superiority over someone they perceived as helpless and unable to defend herself. The parents appeared torn between intervening to stop what was clearly becoming a problematic situation and staying out of it to avoid making themselves targets of Marcus's attention and potentially jeopardizing their children's continued training at the gym. Their discomfort was obvious, but the social dynamics of the situation made intervention difficult and potentially costly. Sarah looked down at Dany, whose eyes were wide with worry, embarrassment, and the helpless feeling of watching someone you love being targeted by a bully who held power over an important aspect of your life. His expression conveyed his desperation for this situation to end, his wish that they could simply leave and pretend this had never happened, and his growing understanding that his coach was not the man he had thought he was. Then she looked back at Marcus, whose smug expression suggested he was already savoring his inevitable victory, already imagining how he would describe this demonstration to future students as an example of why real training mattered and why civilians should respect the superiority of dedicated fighters who had earned their positions through years of hard work and sacrifice. "One condition," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new note that made several people look at her more carefully, though they couldn't quite identify what had changed about her tone or demeanor. There was something different in her voice, a subtle shift that suggested hidden depths and capabilities that weren't immediately apparent. Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the idea that someone in her position thought they could negotiate terms or make demands in his gym, on his territory, surrounded by his students and supporters. "Oh, and what might that be?" he asked with exaggerated patience, the tone of someone humoring a child who was making unreasonable demands or failing to understand the reality of their situation. "When this is over," Sarah said with calm certainty that seemed to come from some deep well of confidence that surprised everyone present, including herself. "You apologize to your fighters for this display. You acknowledge that this wasn't teaching or instruction, but rather an abuse of your position and authority that violated basic principles of respect and sportsmanship." Marcus's laughter echoed through the gym, sharp and mocking, the sound of someone who found the very idea of apologizing to be absurd and entertaining. "Apologize?" he repeated incredulously, his voice carrying disbelief and amusement at what he considered to be a completely unrealistic expectation. "Lady, you're going to be the one apologizing to the canvas when you hit it. You'll be lucky if you can apologize through a mouthful of mat." Several fighters winced at their coach's cruelty, recognizing that his behavior was reflecting poorly on all of them and making them complicit in something that felt fundamentally wrong. They understood that they would be associated with this incident regardless of their personal feelings about it, and many of them were beginning to question their respect for someone who would behave this way toward a customer and parent. But Sarah's expression remained unchanged, showing no fear, no anger, no desperation, no indication that his threats or insults were having any effect on her emotional state or decision-making process. She simply nodded, with the calm acceptance of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to follow through with whatever consequences might result from her choice. She began removing her jacket with deliberate care, folding it neatly and setting it aside with the precise movements of someone who understood the importance of preparation and attention to detail. As she did so, she revealed lean, well-defined arms that spoke of years of disciplined training and physical conditioning, muscle definition that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The muscle development was not the bulky, obvious musculature of a bodybuilder or casual fitness enthusiast, but rather the functional, efficient development that came from countless hours of dedicated work with specific, demanding activities. Her shoulders showed the definition that came from repetitive striking motions, Her forearms displayed the conditioning that resulted from heavy bag work, and her overall build suggested someone who had spent significant time developing real functional strength rather than mere aesthetic appearance. "Mom!" Dany whispered urgently, his voice tight with worry and confusion as he began to notice details about his mother that he had never paid attention to before. "You don't have to do this. We can just leave. It doesn't matter what he thinks or what anyone else thinks about us." Sarah squeezed her son's hand gently, her touch conveying reassurance and love, even as she prepared for what was about to unfold. Her grip was firm and confident, the hands of someone who understood their own capabilities and was not afraid to use them when circumstances demanded action. "Sometimes, honey," she said softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned hard lessons about when to walk away and when to stand firm. "Bullies need to be reminded that strength comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who choose not to show their power until it becomes absolutely necessary." As Sarah moved toward the center of the makeshift ring area, her movement suddenly underwent a dramatic transformation that was subtle enough that most observers missed it initially, but profound enough that it changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The shuffling walk of a tired suburban mother melted away like snow in sunlight, replaced by the fluid, measured steps of someone who understood combat on an intimate level, someone whose body remembered lessons learned through years of intense training and competitive experience at the highest levels. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her center of gravity lowering slightly as her body automatically assumed the optimal positioning for balance and mobility. Her weight distribution became more balanced, spreading evenly across both feet in a way that provided maximum stability while maintaining the ability to move quickly in any direction. Her movement took on the predatory grace of someone who could explode into action at any moment, someone whose body was a perfectly tuned instrument of controlled violence. The change was so gradual and so natural that it seemed like she was simply walking more confidently. But to anyone who truly understood fighting at a professional level, the transformation was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. Everything about her movement now spoke of years of professional training, of muscle memory developed through countless hours of practice, and of someone who had faced elite competition and emerged victorious. Marcus, busy adjusting his gloves and playing to his audience with exaggerated displays of warming up, missed the change entirely. His attention was focused on his performance, on maintaining the theatrical atmosphere he had created, and on savoring the anticipation of demonstrating his superiority in front of people who depended on his instruction and approval. He was so caught up in his own ego and the drama he was creating that he failed to notice the fundamental shift that had occurred in his chosen victim. "All right, folks," he announced loudly, spreading his arms to encompass his entire audience in a gesture that emphasized his role as the master of ceremonies and primary attraction. "Gather around and make this educational. You're about to see a perfect demonstration of why years of dedicated training matter, why technique and experience trump good intentions every single time, and why there's no substitute for real boxing knowledge and competitive experience." What Marcus didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except for Dany, was that Sarah Martinez had once been Sarah Rodriguez, two-time women's professional boxing champion, who had dominated the welterweight division for 8 consecutive years, with a combination of technical brilliance, tactical intelligence, and devastating power that had made her one of the most feared fighters in the sport. She had earned the nickname Silent Thunder for her unique combination of calm, analytical demeanor outside the ring and explosive, devastating combinations inside it. Her fighting style had been characterized by technical precision that bordered on perfection, tactical intelligence that allowed her to solve any puzzle an opponent presented, and the kind of controlled violence that separated true professionals from talented amateurs. For 8 years, she had been considered one of the most dangerous fighters in her weight class, facing and systematically defeating Olympic medalists who had dedicated their entire lives to boxing excellence, professional champions from multiple countries who brought different styles and challenges, and rising stars who had been groomed by the best trainers in the world and were expected to represent the future of the sport. Her record included victories over fighters who had gone on to become legends in their own right, and her defensive skills had been so advanced that some opponents had never managed to land a clean shot during entire 12-round championship fights. She had been known for her ability to make elite fighters look amateurish, to solve their styles completely and systematically dismantle their games while making it look effortless. She had retired suddenly at 27, not from defeat or injury, but from a tragedy that had shattered her world and changed her priorities forever. Her younger sister, also a professional fighter who had been following in Sarah's footsteps and was expected to eventually challenge for world titles herself, had been killed by a drunk driver while rushing to attend one of Sarah's championship defenses. The accident had occurred on a rainy highway late at night, and her sister had been driving faster than she should have been in her excitement to watch Sarah defend her championship against a highly regarded challenger. The weather conditions had been poor, visibility had been limited, and when the drunk driver had crossed the center line, her sister had been unable to avoid the collision that claimed her life instantly. The guilt had been overwhelming and all-consuming, eating away at Sarah's soul like acid. If Sarah hadn't been competing that night, if she hadn't achieved the success that made her sister so proud and excited, if she had chosen a different career path entirely, her sister wouldn't have been on that highway at that moment. The rational part of her mind understood that the drunk driver was responsible, that the weather conditions had contributed, that accidents happened regardless of anyone's career choices or decisions. But the emotional reality was that her sister had died because of something directly related to Sarah's boxing career, and that knowledge had been impossible to bear. Every time she stepped into the ring after that, every time she heard the crowd cheering, every time she raised her gloved hands in victory, she thought about her sister who would never again share in her success or celebrate her achievements. Sarah had walked away from everything, the championship belts that represented years of dedication and sacrifice, the lucrative endorsement deals that would have provided financial security for life, the training facilities that had become her second home, and the identity she had built over nearly a decade of professional competition. She had turned her back on fame, fortune, and the sport that had defined her existence since childhood. She had moved across the country to a place where nobody knew her name or her history, changed her name back to her maiden name to avoid recognition, and sworn never to fight again. For 15 years, she had kept that promise faithfully, channeling her competitive energy and physical discipline into raising Dany as a single mother and building a quiet, successful career as a physical therapist. Her work in physical therapy had allowed her to maintain her understanding of human movement, muscle development, and body mechanics, while helping people recover from injuries and regain their physical capabilities. It was rewarding work that felt like a form of redemption, using her knowledge of the human body to heal and help rather than to compete or dominate. She had found genuine satisfaction in helping others overcome their physical limitations and return to the activities they loved. But now, watching Marcus's smug face as he explained to his captive audience how real boxers handled wannabes and pretenders, Sarah felt the old fire stirring deep within her chest. Not the fire of competition or the desire for glory and recognition, but something more fundamental and important: the need to protect her son's dignity and to teach a bully that his actions had consequences. "You ready, Mrs. Martinez?" Marcus called out, bouncing lightly on his toes, in what he probably thought was an intimidating display of athletic readiness and professional competence. His movement was technically sound, but theatrical, designed more for show than for actual combat preparation, more about intimidation than optimization. Sarah centered herself in the middle of the designated sparring area, her breathing becoming deeper and more controlled, as muscle memory that had been dormant for 15 years began to reassert itself like water finding its natural level. Around her, the watching crowd grew quieter, sensing something they couldn't quite identify, but which made the atmosphere feel more serious and potentially dangerous than it had moments before. "Just remember, everyone," Marcus announced to his audience with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged by truly elite opposition. "This is exactly why we train seriously day after day, year after year, sacrificing our time and energy to develop real skills. You can't fake experience, you can't substitute good intentions for technical knowledge, and you can't pretend that enthusiasm makes up for lack of proper instruction and competitive experience." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Throughout her professional career, she had faced Olympic medalists who had dedicated their entire lives to boxing excellence from childhood, professional champions who had fought on the biggest stages in the world against the best competition available, and rising stars who had been training since they could walk with the best coaches money could buy and access to every advantage modern sports science could provide. Marcus, for all his regional success and local reputation, was about to learn what real experience looked like when it was combined with genuine humility and the wisdom that came from facing truly elite competition on the world's biggest stages. He was about to discover the difference between being a big fish in a small pond and swimming in the ocean with apex predators. "Any last words before we begin this educational demonstration?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with false courtesy and barely concealed anticipation of the humiliation he was about to inflict on someone he had already dismissed as harmless and helpless. Sarah looked directly into his eyes for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, her gaze steady and unwavering, carrying depths that suggested years of experience dealing with far more dangerous and skilled opponents than a regional boxing coach with delusions of grandeur. What Marcus saw there made him take an involuntary step backward, his confident expression faltering slightly as he encountered something he hadn't expected and couldn't quite process or understand. Not fear or uncertainty, which he had been anticipating and looking forward to exploiting, but the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had been playing the role of prey and was now ready to reveal their true nature. It was the look of someone who had faced the best fighters in the world and emerged victorious, someone who understood violence at a level that few humans ever experienced. "Yes," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent gym despite its soft volume. "You might want to remember that the most dangerous fighters are often the ones who choose not to show their skills until it becomes absolutely necessary. Real power doesn't need to announce itself or seek validation from others." Marcus's confident smirk faltered noticeably, but his pride and his need to maintain his image in front of his fighters wouldn't allow him to back down now. He had committed himself to this demonstration in front of too many people, and his entire reputation was built on the foundation of being the dominant figure in this environment. Backing down now would undermine everything he had built and destroy his credibility with the people who depended on him for instruction and guidance. "All right then," Marcus said, shaking off his momentary uncertainty with visible effort and trying to recapture his earlier bravado. "Let's get this educational demonstration over with so everyone can go home with a clear understanding of what real training produces." He began shadow boxing with exaggerated movements, throwing elaborate combinations that were clearly designed to intimidate rather than to prepare for actual combat. His technique was solid, but theatrical, more performance than preparation, more about creating atmosphere than optimizing his physical and mental readiness for the encounter that was about to unfold. The other fighters watched with a mixture of excitement and growing concern, while the parents looked increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Several of them were beginning to recognize that this had moved far beyond appropriate boundaries and were considering whether they should intervene to stop what was clearly becoming a problematic situation that could have lasting negative consequences for everyone involved. Sarah, meanwhile, stood perfectly still in the center of the ring area, her breathing having become deep and rhythmic in a pattern that those few people who knew what to look for might have recognized as the preparation routine of someone who had spent years learning to control their body and mind under extreme pressure and in high-stakes situations. The subtle shift in her stance was almost imperceptible to casual observers, but her center of gravity had lowered slightly. Her weight had distributed evenly across both feet in perfect balance, and her hands had found positions that looked casual but provided optimal defensive positioning while maintaining the ability to launch attacks with maximum speed and efficiency. "Mom, please," Dany whispered from his position just outside the ring area, his voice tight with anxiety and confusion as he watched his mother prepare for something he didn't fully understand. "You don't have anything to prove to anyone here. Let's just go home and forget this ever happened." Sarah turned to her son with a gentle smile that conveyed both love and reassurance, the expression of someone who wanted to comfort a child while also preparing to handle a difficult situation that required her full attention and capabilities. "Sometimes, sweetheart," she said softly, "it's not about proving anything to other people. It's about teaching important lessons about respect, humility, and the consequences of bullying behavior." Marcus finished his warm-up routine with a flourish, throwing a series of combinations that whistled audibly through the silence and demonstrated the power and speed that had earned him his regional championships and local reputation. His technique was impressive by local standards, showing the kind of development that came from years of dedicated training and competitive experience against regional opposition. "Hope you've been saying your prayers, Mrs. Martinez," he said with theatrical cruelty that revealed his true character more clearly than any previous statement. "This demonstration might sting a little, but it will be educational for everyone here. Sometimes the best lessons are the ones that hurt just enough to be memorable and create lasting understanding." Around the room, several parents exchanged worried glances, recognizing that this had moved far beyond any reasonable definition of instruction or demonstration. The atmosphere had become genuinely concerning, with their children's coach apparently committed to physically dominating a woman who appeared to have no boxing training and no ability to defend herself against someone with his experience and physical advantages. Sarah could hear the murmurs of concern and disapproval from the watching crowd, but she paid them no attention, focusing instead on the task at hand and the preparation that would be necessary to handle the situation appropriately. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, allowing muscle memory that had been dormant for 15 years to resurface like water finding its natural level after a dam had been removed. Her body remembered everything, the countless hours of training with world-class coaches who had pushed her to the limits of human performance, the precise timing required for effective counters that could end fights in milliseconds, the ability to read an opponent's rhythm and intentions before they themselves knew what they were going to do, the techniques for disrupting timing and creating openings where none had existed before, and most importantly, the mental discipline required to remain calm and analytical under pressure while making split-second decisions that could determine victory or defeat. When she opened her eyes, Something fundamental had changed about her entire presence and the energy she projected. The tired suburban mom was gone, completely replaced by someone who moved with predatory grace and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the best fighters in the world and emerged victorious. The transformation was so complete and so subtle that most observers couldn't identify exactly what had changed, but everyone could sense that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. Marcus noticed the transformation and frowned, his earlier confidence wavering as he tried to process what he was seeing and understand how someone's entire presence could change so completely in the span of a few seconds. "You've been holding out on us, haven't you?" he asked, his tone becoming slightly less certain than it had been moments earlier. "Taken a few cardio boxing classes at the community center? Maybe some self-defense workshops at the local gym, or watch some instructional videos online?" His questions revealed his inability to comprehend the possibility that he was facing someone with genuine, elite-level experience. "Something like that," Sarah replied softly, her voice carrying an undertone that made several people in the audience look at her with new attention and growing unease, though they couldn't identify exactly what had changed about her demeanor or presence. "Well, no matter," Marcus said, trying to recapture his earlier bravado and convince himself that whatever he was seeing was irrelevant to the outcome of the demonstration. "A little weekend warrior training won't help you here. There's a world of difference between hitting pads in a fitness class and facing someone who actually knows how to fight and has years of competitive experience." Marcus began circling her slowly, still playing to his audience and clearly enjoying the theatrical aspects of the situation. His movement was technically sound, showing the footwork and positioning that had served him well in regional competition. But it was also predictable and designed more for intimidation than for tactical advantage. He was moving like someone who expected easy victory and was more concerned with showmanship than with optimal preparation. "See, folks," he continued his lecture while maintaining his circling pattern, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed he was delivering important wisdom. "This is exactly what happens when people overestimate their abilities based on limited exposure to martial arts. Real boxing isn't like the movies where the hero can suddenly fight like a professional with no training or experience." He gestured broadly as he circled, emphasizing his points while maintaining what he thought was an intimidating presence. "It takes years of dedicated work to develop real power in your punches, effective technique that works under pressure, and the kind of reflexes that matter in actual combat situations where there's no second chance to get it right." Sarah remained motionless in the center of the ring, turning only her head to track his movement with the minimal effort that conserved energy while maintaining visual contact and gathering information about his movement patterns, preferred angles, and tactical tendencies. To an untrained eye, she looked passive, almost defenseless, like someone who was frozen with fear or uncertainty about how to respond to his aggressive posturing. But to anyone who understood fighting at a high level, her stillness was deeply unnerving, like a coiled spring waiting for precisely the right moment to release all of its stored energy. Every aspect of her positioning was deliberate and optimized, from her breathing pattern to her foot placement to the angle of her shoulders and the position of her hands. "The thing about boxing," Marcus continued his educational monologue while maintaining his circling pattern, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice and the opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge in front of his audience, "is that it takes years to develop real power in your punches. You can't just watch a few instructional videos on the internet and think you're ready for the real thing." He threw a few air punches to emphasize his points, his movements sharp and technically proficient but also theatrical and designed more for effect than for actual preparation. There's no substitute for thousands of hours of proper training under qualified instruction, sparring with experienced partners, and the kind of competitive experience that teaches you how to handle pressure and adversity. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed, her voice carrying an odd note that made several people in the audience look at her more closely, though they couldn't quite identify what had changed about her tone or the way she was carrying herself. There was something different about her now, something that suggested hidden depths and capabilities that weren't immediately apparent. Marcus paused his circling, clearly surprised by her agreement and momentarily uncertain about how to proceed with his predetermined script. He had been expecting fear, defiance, or desperate attempts to negotiate her way out of the situation. Her calm acceptance of his statements was not what he had anticipated, and it threw off his rhythm slightly. "Exactly," he said, trying to regain his momentum and recapture the flow of his performance. "So maybe we should just call this off before someone gets hurt unnecessarily. I think I've made my point about the importance of proper training and realistic expectations about personal capabilities." "No," Sarah interrupted gently, her voice carrying a certainty that sent a ripple of unease through the room like a stone dropped into still water. "You wanted to teach a lesson about real boxing and the difference between trained fighters and regular people. Let's teach that lesson properly and completely." The absolute certainty in her voice, combined with the subtle but unmistakable shift in her presence and the way she carried herself, sent a chill through the watching crowd. Even Marcus seemed to sense that something had fundamentally changed, though his pride and his need to maintain his image prevented him from backing down or asking questions about what he was seeing. "Fine," he said, settling into what he thought was an intimidating fighting stance, his hands coming up in a technically correct guard position that showed years of proper instruction. "But don't say I didn't warn you about what happens when amateurs try to play with professionals who have earned their positions through years of hard work and sacrifice." Marcus launched forward with a textbook jab-cross combination, the kind of attack sequence he had probably used successfully thousands of times against various opponents throughout his career. It was fast by local standards, technically sound according to everything he had been taught, and delivered with the full weight of his considerable frame behind it. The combination showed proper form, good timing, and the kind of power that had earned him his regional championships and local reputation. It never came close to landing. Sarah moved like water flowing around a stone, her head slipping the jab with minimal movement that required no wasted energy or dramatic evasion. She stepped off the center line at precisely the right moment to let the cross slice through empty air where her face had been a split second before. The movement was so subtle, so economical, and so perfectly timed that several observers weren't even sure she had moved at all. The evasion looked almost accidental, as if she had simply happened to move at exactly the right moment through pure chance rather than through any deliberate defensive action. But to anyone who understood boxing at a professional level, the movement was a masterpiece of timing, distance management, and energy conservation. Marcus stumbled slightly, his momentum carrying him past his intended target as his punches found nothing but air. His eyes widened in confusion and growing concern as he tried to process what had just happened. Those punches should have connected easily against someone with no training or defensive skills. He had used that exact combination successfully hundreds of times before against opponents who were supposedly more skilled than a suburban mother with no boxing background. "Lucky slip," he muttered, resetting his stance and trying to convince himself that what had just occurred was a fluke rather than evidence that he had seriously misjudged the situation and his opponent's capabilities. "Won't happen twice. Nobody gets that lucky twice in a row." Sarah said nothing in response, simply returning to her centered position in the middle of the ring and waiting with the patient stillness of someone who was completely comfortable with whatever was about to unfold. Her breathing remained controlled and rhythmic, and her expression showed no strain, no concern, no indication that avoiding his attack had required any significant effort or concentration. This time, Marcus tried a more complex combination designed to overwhelm any amateur defenses and ensure that at least one punch would find its target. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut. Each punch was technically proficient, thrown with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in his home environment, and delivered with increasing desperation as he began to realize that his initial assessment of the situation might have been seriously flawed. Each punch found nothing but air. Sarah moved like smoke, her head slipping punches by millimeters, her body swaying just out of range with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic to watch. She never looked rushed, never seemed off balance, never appeared to be struggling or working hard to avoid his attacks. It was as if she could see each attack coming seconds before Marcus himself knew what he was going to throw. Her movement was fluid and continuous, like a dancer performing a choreographed routine that she had practiced thousands of times. Every evasion was minimal but perfectly timed, every step was precisely placed, and every defensive action seemed to flow naturally into the next, as if she was following some internal rhythm that only she could hear. Around the room, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically from entertainment to something approaching awe and confusion. The excited chatter had died completely, replaced by an electric tension that made everyone hold their breath as they tried to process what they were witnessing. Even the youngest fighters could sense they were seeing something extraordinary, something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how fighting worked and what was possible with the human body. Marcus's confidence began to crack visibly, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized that none of his attacks were even close to connecting. His breathing became more labored, not just from physical exertion, but from the psychological pressure of realizing that his carefully constructed image of dominance was crumbling before an audience of people who looked up to him and depended on his expertise. "Stand still and fight like you mean it," he snarled, launching into a more aggressive series of strikes driven more by frustration and wounded pride than by tactical thinking or strategic planning. His technique was still sound, but desperation was beginning to replace calculation, and his attacks were becoming more wild and less controlled as his confidence continued to erode. Sarah continued her ethereal dance of evasion, avoiding each technique with minimal effort while something else began to happen that only the most observant watchers noticed. She was moving closer with each evasion, subtly closing the distance while Marcus exhausted himself, throwing increasingly desperate attacks. Her movement was like a tide slowly advancing up a beach, inexorable and patient, impossible to stop or reverse. "What's she doing?" whispered one of the teenage fighters, his voice barely audible in the tense silence that had settled over the gym like a heavy blanket. "She's making him tired," observed another more perceptively, recognizing the tactical brilliance of allowing an aggressive opponent to exhaust themselves while maintaining perfect defensive positioning and gradually improving the tactical situation. "And she's getting closer every time he swings." Marcus threw a wild overhand right, putting everything he had behind it in a last desperate attempt to land something significant and salvage his reputation. Sarah ducked under it smoothly, and for the first time since the demonstration had begun, she made contact with him. Just a light tap on his exposed ribs as he spun past her, so gentle it couldn't have hurt a child, but the message was crystal clear. "I could have hurt you there, but I chose not to." The touch sent a shock through Marcus that was far more profound than any physical pain could have been. It was proof that she had been controlling the entire encounter from the beginning, that she could have ended it at any moment if she had chosen to do so, and that his complete inability to touch her was not luck or chance, but skill, far beyond anything he had ever encountered or imagined possible. Marcus spun around, his face flushed with exertion and growing panic, his carefully constructed image of invincibility crumbling with each passing second. "What are you playing at?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of physical exhaustion and psychological pressure. "Fight back like you mean it. Stop playing games." "I am fighting," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who was completely in control of the situation and had been from the very beginning. "I'm just choosing how to do it and choosing how much to show you." The profundity of her statement hung in the air like a revelation, changing everyone's understanding of what they had been witnessing. She wasn't running or cowering or desperately trying to survive his attacks. She was demonstrating a level of control, skill, and tactical understanding that none of them had ever seen before. Every movement was deliberate, every evasion was precisely calculated, and every choice was made from a position of complete dominance that she was choosing not to exercise fully. Marcus, his breath coming in ragged gasps and his confidence completely shattered, made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation and his reputation. He dropped low and lunged forward, trying to clinch and use his significant weight advantage to overwhelm her through brute force rather than technique. It was exactly the wrong move against exactly the wrong person, the choice of someone who had abandoned skill in favor of desperation and was grasping for any possible way to avoid complete humiliation. As Marcus lunged forward with all his remaining energy, Sarah did something that defied everything the watching crowd thought they understood about boxing, physics, and the fundamental dynamics of combat. She didn't try to back away or defend against the clinch attempt, which would have been the natural response for someone trying to avoid being overpowered by a larger, stronger opponent. Instead, she stepped forward into it, her movement so unexpected and so perfectly timed that Marcus's forward momentum became a weapon turned against him. Sarah's hands found his shoulders with the precision of someone who understood leverage, timing, and the biomechanics of human movement at the highest level. Using a technique that looked almost gentle, more like a dance move than a fighting technique, she guided his energy downward and to the side while stepping away from the line of his attack. The movement utilized his own momentum against him while requiring minimal effort on her part, a perfect demonstration of the principle that technique and timing could overcome raw physical strength when applied by someone who truly understood the science of combat. It was a masterclass in leverage, physics, and the application of minimal force to achieve maximum effect. Marcus crashed to the canvas with a resounding thud that echoed through the silent gym like a gunshot, the sound of his body hitting the mat serving as a punctuation mark to the complete reversal of everything everyone had expected to witness. The impact was jarring, not just physically for Marcus, but psychologically for everyone who had assumed they understood how this encounter would unfold. The room erupted in gasps and shocked whispers as the watching crowd tried to process the impossibility of what they had just seen. Parents and fighters alike struggled to understand how someone who appeared to be a completely ordinary suburban mother had just systematically dismantled their coach's attack and then deposited him on the canvas with what appeared to be minimal effort. Marcus lay still for a moment, stunned not just by the physical impact of hitting the mat, but by the complete impossibility of what had just happened to him. He had been the aggressor. He had initiated every attack. He had all the momentum and weight advantage, and somehow he had ended up on the canvas while his opponent stood calmly above him, not even breathing hard or showing any signs of exertion or strain. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, filled with the weight of realization, as everyone present began to understand that they had just witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about strength, skill, and the nature of real expertise. This hadn't been a lucky accident or a fluke occurrence. This had been a systematic demonstration of superior ability. Marcus pushed himself up on his elbows, staring at Sarah with a mixture of confusion, dawning respect, and the beginning of genuine understanding about what he had just experienced. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, all of his earlier arrogance and theatricality completely gone, replaced by genuine bewilderment and the first stirrings of humility. Sarah extended her hand to help him up, the gesture of someone who bore no malice despite the humiliation he had attempted to inflict on her and the disrespect he had shown. Her offer of assistance was genuine, reflecting her character and values rather than any desire for revenge or continued dominance. 15 years of professional training before I ever made the choice to step away from the ring and focus on what really mattered to me, she said simply, her explanation carrying no boastfulness or pride, just honest acknowledgement of the experience that had made her response possible. Marcus ignored the offered hand and scrambled to his feet on his own, his face burning with embarrassment and wounded pride, but also with the beginning of genuine respect for someone whose abilities far exceeded anything he had imagined possible. Around the room, his fighters watched with wide eyes, seeing their seemingly invincible coach reduced to a confused, humbled man who was struggling to process what had just happened to him. "That's impossible," Marcus muttered, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire worldview had just been challenged and found wanting. You're just a regular mom, a normal person who comes to pick up her kid. This doesn't make any sense." "No," Sarah said gently but firmly, her voice carrying the patience of someone who was prepared to explain important truths to someone who needed to learn them. "I'm a person who chose to step away from professional boxing to focus on what really mattered to me, raising my son and building a life that had meaning beyond competition and glory. But that choice doesn't mean I forgot everything I learned during 8 years of professional competition at the highest levels." The truth hit the room like a physical force, rippling through the crowd as people began to understand that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a lucky amateur getting the better of an overconfident coach. This wasn't some fortunate accident or fluke occurrence. This was a demonstration of skill, experience, and tactical understanding that operated on a completely different level from anything they had previously encountered. Dany stepped forward, his eyes bright with tears of pride, relief, and newfound understanding of his mother's history and capabilities. For years, he had known that his mother had some background in boxing, but he had never fully understood the extent of her achievements or the level at which she had competed. "Mom was Sarah Rodriguez," he announced to the stunned room, his voice carrying the pride of someone who was finally able to share a secret he had carried for years. "Two-time women's professional welterweight champion. She retired when I was little, but she never lost any of her skills or knowledge." The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the weight of realization and the profound shift in everyone's understanding of what they had just witnessed. Several of the older fighters immediately pulled out their phones, clearly searching for the name Dany had provided. Their expressions shifted rapidly from skepticism to amazement as they found videos, articles, and records of Sarah's legendary professional career. Marcus's face went through a complex series of emotions as the full scope of his mistake became clear. Shock at learning who he had challenged, embarrassment at his behavior and the disrespect he had shown, and finally something that might have been the beginning of genuine wisdom and humility. He looked around at his fighters, then back at Sarah, understanding that he had just received an education that was worth far more than any regional championship or local recognition. I owe you a serious apology," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of his earlier arrogance or theatrical bravado. "And I owe all of them one, too." He gestured toward his fighters with genuine remorse, recognizing that his behavior had reflected poorly on all of them and had violated basic principles of respect and sportsmanship. Sarah nodded with the grace of someone who understood that genuine learning often required humility and the willingness to admit mistakes. The strongest thing any person can do is admit when they're wrong and commit to doing better. Your fighters will respect you more for that honesty, not less. Marcus straightened his shoulders and turned to face his class, his expression showing genuine remorse and the beginning of real wisdom. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable, as if the encounter had stripped away years of accumulated arrogance and revealed the person he could be if he chose to learn from his mistakes. "Everyone, I made a serious mistake today that I need to acknowledge and learn from," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion and sincerity. "I let my ego make decisions that my brain and my heart should have made. Mrs. Martinez showed me what real boxing expertise looks like, and more importantly, she showed me what real strength and character look like." He paused, looking around at the faces of his students, many of whom were seeing him display genuine vulnerability for the first time. Not just the physical techniques, but the wisdom to know when and how to use them, and the restraint to use only what was necessary to teach a lesson without causing unnecessary harm. The gym remained silent as the weight of the lesson settled over everyone present, each person processing what they had witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of strength, skill, and character. The demonstration had become something far more valuable than anyone had anticipated, a lesson in humility, respect, and the true nature of expertise. Sarah gathered her jacket and moved toward Dany, who looked at her with newfound respect, understanding, and pride in knowing that his mother was not just the caring, supportive parent he had always known, but also someone who had achieved greatness in her chosen field before choosing to dedicate herself to raising him and building a meaningful life beyond competition. As they prepared to leave, Marcus called out softly, his voice carrying genuine respect and gratitude. "Mrs. Martinez?" She turned back to him, her expression open and patient, showing no trace of vindictiveness or desire to prolong his embarrassment. "Thank you," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of genuine appreciation and recognition of the gift she had given him. "For showing me what real strength looks like, and for teaching me something I should have learned years ago but was too proud to understand." Sarah smiled gently, her expression showing forgiveness and understanding, the response of someone who had learned through her own experiences that everyone deserved the opportunity to grow and improve. "Real strength isn't what you demonstrated tonight, Coach Rivera. Real strength is what you choose to do next, how you choose to lead from here, and whether you can turn this experience into something that makes you a better teacher and a better person." As mother and son walked toward the exit, the gym slowly began to buzz with quiet conversation. But it was different from the usual chatter that filled the space after training sessions. The fighters looked at their coach with new eyes, seeing someone who had been humbled but not broken, educated rather than defeated, and who had shown the courage to admit his mistakes and commit to doing better. Marcus stood in the center of the ring, looking around at faces that held not mockery or disrespect, but genuine respect for his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them. For the first time in years, he felt like he might actually have the opportunity to become the teacher and mentor his fighters deserved, rather than the ego-driven bully he had allowed himself to become. The lesson that had unfolded in the Golden Gloves Academy that evening would be remembered and discussed for years to come, not just as a demonstration of superior fighting skills, but as an example of how true strength manifested itself through character, restraint, and the wisdom to know when violence was necessary and when mercy was the more powerful choice. It had been a masterclass in more than just boxing technique. It had been a lesson in humanity, humility, and the courage required to change oneself for the better.